All right, can I get everybody to take your seats, please? First of all, thank you to all the local bakers for supplying some awesome treats. And at any time today, if you want to get up and grab some more food, there's tons, and there's coffee and tea and water, so please help yourself.
I can't take it all back to the Kusch with me.
My name is Liz Gillis, and I'm part of the Friends of the Burton Walkway. And we're your host today, bringing in our guest speaker, Kyle Kusch. So I'd like to welcome everyone here this afternoon. It's a wonderful turnout. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with us. First of all, I would like to extend or offer a special welcome to those here today who have a family member or a friend who is buried at this historical site. We welcome your feedback on this presentation, and we thank you for being here. And in fact, I just learned that there's a couple of people who travel from Armstrong and Vernon to be here today. So welcome to Burton. Back to Burton. So the name of our presentation today is Digging into the Past. This year we're celebrating 100 years of the Burton Historical Cemetery. And we are so fortunate to have worked with Kyle Kusch and his volunteer team at the Arrow Lakes Historical Society. And I know some of the board members are here and volunteers at the back from that society, so thank you for coming down. I also want to bring your attention to, we have a couple of donation jars here to help the Historical Society. So the goodies are free, but if you can throw in a buck to the jar, we'd appreciate it. Before I introduce Kyle, I just wanted to bring everybody up to speed on the work that we've been doing for the walkway, what we've been up to, and how the volunteer committee of our walkway was inspired to take on the cemetery. So if you want to go to the next slide, Vanna White. So the Friends of the Burton Walkway are a volunteer group. And our job is to maintain and improve the walkway. It's a 1 kilometer accessible trail between the cemetery land and the historical campground. Generally, we focus on 2 things: an annual spring cleanup that sometimes happens in March, but not this year, and an improvement project. The walkway was first established by Burton seniors back in 2003. We have kind of 2 groups that help us. First of all, we have a working group, and all of our members are here today: Christine Adsed, Margaret Simpson, Gail Detta, Mary Davis, Inga Ivany, Gary Mentz, Rosalie Crana, and myself. And we work kind of all year round, figuring out priorities, making decisions, applying for money, grant money, that kind of thing. And then we have a very large extended family of volunteers that help us when we need help. People come out for the annual spring cleanup and do special projects for us. And it is roughly about 20 to 30 people. It sounds like a lot, but if you've ever been part of a trail maintenance group, you need all the help you can get. So if you have some time that you'd like to support us in any of these special projects, we love your help. The Burton Walkway group, the Friends of the Burton Walkway, started with improving the entrance project back in 2019 and 2020. We brought in 3 tandem truckloads of large rock, riprap, established 2 new entrances, created new signage, and we also brought in a truckload of mulch. On the left-hand side, you see Russell Hop, I think, machinery, and he helped us with getting the rock and placing the rock. And you can see the little white sign that we had from the beginning of the walkway. And then we moved to this larger sign here as part of our first phase of our work. Other walkway activities that we've been a part of and doing is last year we spread over 60 yards of gravel. We mitigated a flood risk area, we fire smarted areas, established entrance planters, did some erosion control, pruning dead trees and removing dead trees, pruning trees, remove dead trees, stained and painted. And if you look at that photo, all those rocks were part of our erosion activity, and those were pretty much hand-placed. Well, they were all hand-placed by volunteers, and we worked a chain gang over 2 days. It was hard work, but made a huge difference. And here's some of our volunteer. I keep getting feedback from this. I'll stand over here. Volunteers, of course, make a huge difference in our community. And on the left-hand side is some of that erosion work that we did in the spring. And there's some people hanging out on the trail. Me on a bike, Barb, and a few other guys at the back from last year. And volunteers, as you all know, make a huge difference. Not only did they give time, but they've been giving talent, brawn, and equipment. On the left-hand side, you see Al Ralston. There's been a number of other people who have lent big pieces of machinery to us. Many of them are here today, and thank you so much. We couldn't do the work without that. In the middle is a group of women who we used to all exercise together. And then when COVID happened, we got kicked out of the fitness room, so I yanked them to do a mulch job. They were really happy about that. But I think it was a truck and a pup of mulch that we spread at the campground entrance. And on the right, we have a lot of people with a lot of talent in this community, and I think that's a picture of Ian Gregg doing some fine pruning of some trees. So after we did the entrance, we started looking at the cemetery. And it's like your house. If you start painting one section of your house and then you look at another part of your house and go, oh, that looks worse than I thought it was. So when we looked at the graveyard in the cemetery, we thought, we need to do something about the cemetery. We're all very, very inspired to clean it up. And that's a picture from 2021 when we started cleaning out dead trees and overgrown areas. It was we hadn't been in there for a long time, and we needed to clean up some dead material. That led to this other section of the cemetery. I'm somewhat new in this community. I've been here for about 15 years, and I didn't realize at the time that this was a hump, which we've kind of called at this point, was actually part of the cemetery. And we had seen people put garbage there, there's negative behavior, and we just wanted to do something. So we were inspired to clean that up. And so that's kind of what it looked like before our cleanup. And on the right is what it looked like after our cleanup. And then we put that cross there just to kind of temporarily identify the space. But our working group, like I said, was very inspired. We wanted to bring back some respect and beauty to the space. And Margaret Simpson, who volunteers to organize our active cemetery in town, had old documents of people listed who were buried there, who we'll learn more about from Kyle today. And we were all surprised that she brought a list of 90 people buried in the older part of the cemetery, or the bigger part of the cemetery, and inclusive of this space. So before I hand things over to Kyle, I just wanted to bring everybody up to speed on what we're currently busy on. Number one is we're sharing today this historical research that Kyle and his team have completed for us. Our next step this spring is to professionally map both the trail, the cemetery area, and a potential expansion. And then number three is we are in the beginning processes of designing both a commemorative sign, which will list all the people, and also an interpretive sign, which will tell the story about the cemetery. And we're always looking for help. So that's my last slide, pitch. Today, there's some sign-up sheets at the back as you entered the hall here today. We'd love to keep you informed about what we're doing, or if you can volunteer in any way, we'd appreciate it. We'd also suggest that you donate to the jars up at the kitchen or at the back to the Historical Society. And next week, I think most communities will learn about the next phase of the READY grants, which are community grants, and understand it's the April 11th is our voting day here at the hall. And we do have an active grant for submission to further design the signs. So if you like what we're doing, come down and vote for our next phase of our project. All right, now while you're here, Kyle Kusch. I have the pleasure and honor of introducing Kyle. He is a historian, he's an author, he's our local expert on art history, and he is a big friend of Burton and all the Arrow Lake community. So join me in welcoming Kyle.
I can't live up to that intro. It's far too much pressure. Okay, let's just switch over from one show to another here. I just want to thank the friends of the Burton Walkway and Liz and her awesome crew for bringing us on this project. It's been really fun putting together this show and, being able to help out. We're just doing our job. And that's why the Historical Society is here, for stuff like this. And she mentioned our team, and I have to single out Kathy Froze at the back table back there. There was actually a report that we put together for the Friends of the Burton Walkway, just sort of a short history of the cemetery and how it got to be where it was and how it started. But then the most important thing about the cemetery is that the people who are within the cemetery. And so Kathy, I did all the technical, boring stuff, all the maps and the survey work and stuff. Kathy actually went and researched every one of those names that was on that list and tried to put together at least, a couple sentences or a paragraph or something about each one of those people. Many of them have deep family ties in Burton. Some were only here for a little bit. So I'm sure Liz can point you in the direction of a copy of that report if you're interested in looking at it. And yeah, it's just a really neat document. Based on Margaret Simpson's list of the burials in the cemetery, and the list that was on the Vernon District Family History website. And then we took that, meshed them together. And then we went to BC archives or newspaper clippings and tried to get some more accurate dates on the names, birth and death dates of what we could find for people. And we took those and we made a new list of people who were both interred in the cemetery and people who were transferred from that cemetery into the new cemetery when it was built in '67. At the very least, had their markers moved, because a lot of the markers, you'll notice, are, they're way too old to be in that new cemetery. That's because they were moved to be with their families in the new cemetery. So we also put together some photos of people who were in the cemetery, and that sort of led into this show. So this is, taking that concept and turning it into a proper public presentation, and hopefully an engaging one. So without further ado, let's go digging into the past. So there's the legalese. That's off the RDCK website. Am I standing in the way of this picture, by the way? Okay, I'm good. Pays to be short. So you can see way up in the top left of this RDCK map where the actual original Burton town site is. You can see where all those blocks and lots are. So that's how far into the lake, of course, if you live here, that's how far into the lake the old town site is. Now, you see the big chunk highlighted in blue, that's the parcel of land that the cemetery sits on. But the cemetery itself is just that little triangle in the corner above the old cemetery road, Lower McCormick Road, where the cemetery sits. So it's just that little sliver. That is a BC hydro map dated 29 June 1960. You can see where they've marked all the different property owners, and you can see where they expected the new water line to fall. And the cemetery is that little green triangle. So you can see it was part of the old Louis Montalbetti farm, even though it was removed by being on the other side of what is now McCormick Road. And you can see where the new highway comes in on the side through the old Sandy Marshall property. And you can see where the Berkey farm, way, for more context, is way up at top right. Because it falls on the other side of that colored in blue line, they determined that it had to be covered up so as not to disturb the bodies or displace the remains that were inside the cemetery. That is an aerial photo of Burton in 1929. It's very sparse. You can see just right of center that little tiny bare triangle along that road. That's the cemetery in relation to the town. And the town, at this point, it's pretty sparsely populated. There's only like 3 blocks of actual houses, less than. It does get a bit bigger in the post-war era. And then, of course, the modern highway is way off in the corner here. That's a zoom in. This is another hydro map. You'll see there's a big triangular portion, but only the smaller part of that triangle is the actual cemetery. You can see where there's a line of trees, and that was the line of trees that separated that portion of that parcel of land that was on the Montalbetti property from what was on the Marshall property. That field is technically in Clark Marshall's land. The cemetery and all the graves are sort of rimming the edges of that little triangle. So that's why there's 2 mounds. There's this even further zoom in, 62, and you can, again, see where that line of trees is marking the boundary of the cemetery from the larger field.
And that's Cemetery Road right there.
Yeah, yeah. Variously known as Old Cemetery Road or Lower McCormick Road. I think legally on the RDCK map it is Old Cemetery Road, even though they changed the signs a few years ago. Now we zoom in and we can actually start to see some of the plots. And you can see why there's 2 mounds that were covered up, because one mound covered up everything on the north boundary, and one mound covered up all the graves on the east boundary. There weren't any graves really in the center of it. And so when you walk the pathway today, the walkway, it goes between those 2 mounds. So it's wandering, and you'll see it goes through the middle of the cemetery while not actually tramping on any of the actual interments. That's the only ground level photo that we have of the cemetery. And Jim Robertson let us copy this photo a few years ago. But yeah, that's the Basil Robertson grave. And then you can see in the background the fence with the trees marking the separation between the cemetery and the field. Yeah. So another aerial shot here just for context, so you can see where those graves are. Again, there's a small grouping in one corner and then a small grouping along the east edge. This is 1967, so this photo is taken right before they actually cover it up. A couple of cemeteries, as we'll see later in the show, were covered with cement. Most of the cemeteries that were covered up along the Arrow Lakes were simply covered over with gravel or rock. But it gives you, this really gives you an idea of where the 2 mounds would be and why there are 2 mounds as opposed to one giant one, because the center of it was. That's after the first year of flooding. This is 1969, and this gives you an idea of the 2 mounds. So they were right. They predicted that that high water mark, that blue streak in that map, would come just past the cemetery, right next to the new highway. And that's exactly where it wound up. And you can see the 2 mounds of dirt sticking out of the water. But you can still make out the property line between the Montalbetti and Marshall properties. So here's a recent aerial image. This is from a couple years ago. This is on the RDCK website, so you can look at it. And that gives you, I've highlighted where the property is, where the cemetery is. And you can see that trees, because it's the high point of land, they've colonized those mounds, but you can see where that mound is, and then you can see where the walkway just before the latest batch of work was done on it, splits those 2 mounds. And just to zoom in for further clarification. You can see all the rock work they've done on the side of the food, so that's how close they can get in with aerial photography now. But, and if you look closely, yeah, you can still see exactly where it would kind of lined up with the old fence. That property was given, we can't find any formal deed of transfer records. It was, as you can see, it was always legally part of that lot. This was just Mrs. Gayford, Ellen Gayford, giving a part of her giant farm to the Women's Institute of Burton in 1922 for a burial ground. But we can't find any actual legal record that says that was separated off into a separate parcel. And of course, it doesn't show up on RDC, it just all shows up as one piece of land. But that woman in the middle, Ellen Gayford, she was the one that donated the property. She's probably most famous for being the longtime claim holder of the Kusch hot springs. She was the one that tried to privatize the Kusch hot springs for a solid 20 years. She fought the government trying to run a resort and uphold her mineral claim. Ultimately, the public won, and that's why it's still in public hands. But she's most known here, and that was when she was Ellen McDougall. She originally came here and ran the Leland Hotel. She was the second owner of the Leland Hotel. About 2 months after it was built. So she and her family ran the Leland Hotel for its first few years. But in 1909, she came to Burton and remarried. And so she took the name Gayford, because that was her husband, Thomas Gayford. And he had a son, Jack Gayford. And of course, they all ended up in the cemetery. She ran the Queen's Hotel in Burton, which was one of the earlier hotels in Burton. This is the earliest picture that we have of the town of Burton, when it's still Burton City. And there's some pretty big players early on in Burton that are in this thing, including two of the Burton brothers, Reuben and Byron, who are right at the middle there. The older fellow on this horse at left is Nels de Mars. He was the first non-native settler of the Arrow Lakes. He had been here since the 1860s. Passed away in 1908. So he knew a completely different Arrow Lakes than what anybody else had come, all these new settlers coming into this booming mining town. But yeah, that's the earliest known photo of Burton. That is Arthur Burton, and that's technically, specifically, who this town is named after. Like I said, there were 4 Burton brothers that were here, but specifically it's named for him. And that's his house. Now what's cool is on the back of this photo, Helen Allard wrote, "This is a lean-to, Mr. A.A. Burton, his house, little Burton unknown, but this is Mr. and Mrs. Fuller's first home in 1919, Helen Allard's parents. That was their first house that they bought from Arthur Burton." And now we're looking at the Burton Wharf, the original Burton Wharf, the foot of downtown Burton. Looking back at that beautiful Burton City sign hanging over the top end of the wharf. And if you ever look at this wharf in pictures, it extends for hundreds of meters into what was then the river, because the water would come up and down so far. The actual boathouse is only about halfway up the wharf, but it just because at its narrowest, it was only about 250 meters across. It's hard to think now, but it really, at Burton especially, this was the narrowest point, it really was a river during low water. Yep, absolutely. And of course, everything was water transportation since ancient times, right? Road transportation in this valley is a very unnatural thing. It's only been the last century. So you had to blast these roads out of nothing. So here's the first road crew south of Burton, building the road connecting Burton to Fauquier. And we see a couple of halls, and we see Sandy Robson in that photo, bottom right. Even though Burton emerged in the 1890s, it's really not until the next decade that the first families that wind up staying here come. And so that's why, even though Burton was already nearly 30 years old when the cemetery was founded, it wasn't until the 1920s that they actually needed a cemetery. Because a lot of those early miners all left, and so it was those families that came in the 1910s and the 1900s. Here is the earliest Burton School photo, 1914. And you can see we've already got Sunstroms and McCormicks and Millers, right? I'll point to Joe Joseph, aka Joe Kootenai, who is one of the Joseph family, who were the last Sinaiax family, indigenous family, to live in the valley. You can point everything back. I mean, the two longest lived families here are the Marshalls and the McCormicks. And that's Sarah McCormick and John Harper McCormick. He was a semi-pro ball player. And he and a fellow named Denis Saint Denis built the first baseball field in the Kusch in 1902. The next year, the McCormicks move into Burton, where they purchased this giant farm. And and that's how that all begins. Speaking of said farm, and I really have to thank Alice Watson here for bringing me, 6 years ago now, 2 giant albums full of Hans Loo photographs from the 50s into the 70s. You'll see a few of those pop up in the show here, but yeah, they're just amazing pictures. Lots in the Valhallas, lots in the mountains, but this is a great one just to show you the McCormick farm on this bench. Yep. So I mentioned the Marshalls, and well, there they are at the beginning. So there's Clark Marshall, the father, and then Clark Marshall, the son. The little baby off at right was called Sandy Marshall. And then, right into his 70s and 80s. Still up there in the pack horse. And this is a great shot here, the Marshall family. So Lily Marshall, Mrs. Grimmett, and Florence Marshall, Violet Marshall is Violet Armstrong, and look at those old wooden skis. Nowadays, the skis would just, the bindings would just come off. Could you imagine falling down on a wooden ski and just blowing out your ankle? Yep. This is an interesting one here. This is Elizabeth Moore Bethune, who would have passed away in 1941, I believe. So about 20 years after the cemetery was established. This is her back in England in front of her husband's house, which is also the surgical office and his physician's office. But she came here, and possibly her brother, we don't know. But you'll notice the donor is the estate of Lance Porter. She was the live-in partner of Lance Porter, shall we say. Lance Porter, another one of those early miners, early farmers, but he was one of the few from the very early days of Burton who stayed. He actually stayed in Burton right until the 70s. That's her travel trunk. Burton City, settlers' effects. At the time in this photo, this was up in the attic of the old Marshall home, but this is now in the Kusch Museum. So you can actually go there when you're in the museum. It's right there in the middle of one of the exhibits. And it's pretty cool that they kept that. That's really takes you back to a time and a place. But she passed away in 1941, and almost immediately, Lance Porter marries this woman who had settled in Edgewood just a few years earlier, named Ethel. And a lot of the old-timers here will know more of the story than I do. I don't need to get into the possible sort of details of that, but they marry, and she becomes Effie Porter. So she joins Lance, his cousin Joe Porter, and his wife Hannah And then Lance and Joe's uncle, who was also named Joe, so he was simply called Uncle Joe Porter, almost like it was his formal name. And it's pretty much referred to as so if you go back and read your whistle stops. But we actually found this picture, and it wound just randomly in a bunch of effects, nothing written on it, but a distant relative actually managed to track us down and tell us that this was Effie Hyde, Effie Porter, and her brother back in Somerset in the 1890s. Yeah. That's Joe Porter in the middle there. He actually dies relatively young, about 50. He was 51 years old or so he died in the 30s. So that puts, and he died in 31, I think. So this photo is 1929. The Rogers family at Arrow Park, they were a very big Arrow Park family. Billy Rogers had both the stores. He had a store on the west side and on the east side. The west side store was open 5 days a week. The east side store was open 3 days a week. Just a great shot there. There's Hannah Porter that I mentioned, posing on the original Caribou Creek Bridge. And that's her house in the flood of 1948. Look where the Minto is compared to the house. Yeah. 48 was a crazy flood year. That's the Burton Ballpark, and that's a tugboat being driven through the trees in the Burton Ballpark. No, the original Old Town site, yeah. Yeah, he'd be way too high up now, yeah. That's the Gadon House, and that's the Strachan House during the 1948 flood, as seen from said tug. So, you know, when you, like I said, as you see and as you know, just from being out in the flats, the old Burton Town site is way out there, right at the river bottom. So if the water came up, it wasn't pretty. There was a lot of damage done in 48. Burton got off easy compared to Downtown Trail. If you've seen footage of Downtown Trail. But it was pretty wrong. That's Uncle Joe Porter, who actually outlived his nephew. This is a cool thing that I just processed a few weeks ago. You might have seen this on Facebook, but the O'Keefe Ranch was divesting itself of some artifacts and wanted to send them to places that were more appropriate for those artifacts. And one of those artifacts was the hotel register from the Kootenai Hotel, later the Burton Hotel, from the 1919 to 1933. Yeah. And so if you look closely at this, you don't see a lot of names that are still around in this valley or still have relatives in this valley today. Automobiles weren't completely accepted at this time in this valley, even in the 1920s. So you notice people, even just from Arrow Park, getting a hotel room in Burton for the night if they're in town. There's actually a lot of Arrow Park on that register. If you look at it, Bird's Landing, same thing, right? Just the names in this register itself could be a slideshow on their own. So you notice the owner is listed as Stephen Podbalancic, who's from Fernie and wound up going back to Fernie, I think. This is a few years after he actually sold it, but there's no point in getting a new register printed. So they just kept using that register until it was filled. Walter Williams was the owner of the hotel this time, and eventually became tenant of the cemetery as well. That's how it looked when it was first built. It was built in 1898 or so. And as you can see, pretty ornate. Yeah. 1946, the Williams moved the hotel closer to the highway. Once Highway 6 was officially established, they moved it 3 blocks, but to move it, they had to get rid of the balcony. So people that were here in the 50s and 60s will just remember it as sort of this giant square building. This is a shot on the porch. We got Marcus Daly, the fellow in the pipe hat there with the beard. He was one of those fellows with the horses in that original boat. He's one of those few that actually stuck around. And then next to him is Louis Joseph, who was the last male to live from the original indigenous population at Burton. He actually winds up outliving all of his kids who all pass away from tuberculosis. Here's downtown Burton, mid-20th century, probably mid-50-ish, I'm guessing. But yeah, you can see the hotel, now sans balcony in the background. And then the old Burton Hall that they moved here and then immediately burned, so they had to build this. And then Sears General Store, which was originally, previously Marshall's Coffee Shop. You can still see where it says coffee shop on the sign. Speaking of the hotel, this is taken in front of the Burton Hotel, the Community Hotel. Yeah, you're not going to see that again. 161 pounds. Also something you're probably not going to see again, all those furniture trap. So this is John Whittinger on the left. Of course, I included it here because he's another one of the tenants of the old cemetery. But yeah, we have mink, marten, fox, lynx, coyote, squirrel, and bear. And standing next to him is Wardy Stones, H.W. Stones, the longtime postmaster at Burton, who also was one of the general store owners here. And there's his store. So the Stones General Store was built in the mid-1890s by Frank Bourne, who was one of the Bourne brothers that also had a general store right on the waterfront in the Cusp, sort of below the Leland Hotel on the waterfront. After it went from Frank Bourne to Bob Stephen to David Gash, and then Wardy Stones purchased it in 1923, and he operates it into the 50s. So he's the longest serving postmaster of Old Burton. This is a great shot, because there's definitely still folks in this photo kicking around, because they're only little toddlers in '66 when this last shot of the old stone store is taken. Yeah, in fact, the one on the far right was my grade 2 teacher. All the way back in 19 whatever. If you go down to Edgewood, Ellen Stones, in their community hall, which is the Legion Community Hall, there's actually a clock dedicated to her memory. And it's still there, it still hangs. And so this is in the mid-60s where, yeah, they're there to dedicate this clock in memory of Ellen Stones that's still there. And Wardy Stones, of course, is standing in the background there. Yeah. I mentioned that the cemetery was founded by the Women's Institute. Women's Institutes in the Air Lakes were a big thing right until the time of the dam. In fact, the Edgewood Women's Institute outlasted the dam and went right until 2016, which is pretty rare for a Women's Institute to make it that long. Certainly in the days before the Community Hall Association, Women's Institute was sort of the main community organizer in the village. And these are all big Arrow Lakes surnames, as you can see. Mrs. Marcoli, Mrs. Sundstrom, the original Mrs. Sundstrom, and Robson and Ashdown. Off the top of my head, I think all of those women that I named that ended up in the cemetery here. This is the Sundstrom family and the Turner family on a bridge. I don't know exactly what bridge. And of course, the Sundstroms, a big name in this valley. And the Turners descended from the Baird family of Browse. Ruth Turner was a Baird. These photos were taken by Charles Turner. His grandson, Bob Turner, wound up being the curator of the Royal BC Museum. So if ever you see a book about railways or stern wheelers or something by Robert D. Turner, just know that his dad used to live in what is now the McPhee House overlooking the waterfront in downtown the Cusp. So that's the zoom in, and then here's the wider zoom to show you this rickety old bridge that they're walking across. Covered in rocks, it looks like, too. There's the Women's Institute.
Wearing the Burton Walkway uniform.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. That's a good fundraiser for the Friends of the Burton Walkway. Purchase your own commemorative uniform. Yeah. So let you absorb those names here for a couple seconds. And then, again, not everybody had a car yet. We're almost at that point, but we weren't quite yet. So for big trips, you didn't really have modern buses, but you did have big Berge freight trucks. Walter Miller was the driver for Reuben Berge. And so here they all are on the Needles Ferry. And yeah, they all just rode in the back of this van en route to their meeting at Edgewood. Yeah, so I mentioned Mrs. Bethune before, but you also see lots of other names, like more Sunstroms, the Caffers, and Lily Robertson, who becomes Lily Gourmet, and Mary Williams, the wife of Walter Williams. They were the ones that owned the hotel during the 30s and 40s. I mentioned before that the Fullers, they had bought Arthur Burton's house, that little lean-to. Here they are 20 years later, their 50th wedding anniversary. So these would be the grandparents of all the Allards that grew up here in the 40s and 50s. Yeah. And as you can see, they grew up in a time where you didn't really smile during photography. But there was actually a practical reason behind that. Until they invented like the brownie, you had to pose for about 6 seconds. So you had to be as still as you possibly could, or else you'd have a blurred face when they took the photo. So that's why people look so solemn in a lot of photos. Good. Speaking of the Allards, here's 3 generations of Allards. Yeah, the little girl in there, Leone Allard, winds up becoming Leone Gustafson. So all the Gustafsons that are in the valley. And there's Louise Allard, so the girl, the sister in that photo. Here she is at her wedding, marrying Jim Robson, and then posing with her father. So all the Robsons that are in the valley. Right? 1949. There's Christina Robson, the matriarch of the family, with her granddaughter Katie. And again, you see these, it's cool to see these old little houses that people live in. This is a party at the Sutherland Farm in Carroll's Landing. Of course, Carroll's Landing didn't have a cemetery. A lot of people from Carroll's Landing, people from Mackinson generally were interred in East Arrow Park at that cemetery, which has now been relocated to Glenmac. Whereas people from Carroll's Landing, being further south, were generally interned in Old Burton Cemetery. Again, you just see these names. Johnson's another huge Burton name from the mid-century. Yeah. Seen a lot of women's group photos. Men's groups, well, the big sport here and in the valley in general, because we didn't have hockey rinks, really, in the cusp, and we didn't have a proper hockey rink. We had an outdoor rink, kind of, in the 60s, but we didn't get a proper rink built until the 70s. Baseball was the big sport that connected the valley. And so every little town had a ball team. And again, this is just loaded with big Burton surnames. The guy at the top left, Martin Joseph, that's one of Louis Joseph's sons. I think he passed away at 19 or something, very young. There were an exceptional amount of Welsh people in Carroll's Landing and Burton. So you see names like Davis and Llewellyn and Reese. Also lots of Francophone names, so Allards and Villiers and Mats, Hubert. There's Louis Joseph, the last male to remain at the Oatscott Reserve in Burton, 1910s, 1920s-ish. So whenever you see the story of how Kusch got its name, and they always talk about, Mr. Jordan talking to Chief Louis, yeah, that's who they're talking about. In 1924, he was hired to work on this survey crew, doing a survey of the rapids at the Narrows at Burton. The result of the survey was building a small little wing dam to allow the stern wheelers and the bigger tugs to get through because they had to constantly dredge. Constantly dredge. And you had to get around those rapids. This is a more ominous survey. People will tell you that this survey in 1945 is the beginning of the end, right? Like they're planning that far in advance to do something with this valley. And so here's David McMillan, surveyor with the Geodetic Surveyor of Canada at Burton. And you can see Canada Department of Mines and Resources. That far in advance, they're already thinking, Grand Coulee's built. We can maximize that power somehow. And then with the 48 flood, then all of a sudden, we need flood control too. And so it went. This is the Walker family. So this is the Robertsons. So this is Jim's parents. So Lily Robertson and Basil Robertson. At the C&R farm. So C for Claridge and R for Robertson, C&R. Yeah. That's their wedding day. And back when people actually used to get married in months that weren't June, July, or August. Everybody does that now, but if you look back, like people, they didn't wait for a specific long weekend or a summer break. They would just, you'd have marriages that took place in November and December and things like that. You never see that now. They operated the Burton Trading Company, which was one of the main general stores in town. It was another building that, like the hotel, was moved during the middle of the century to be a bit closer to highway traffic. Here's Mrs. Burnett posing in front of the store as they've got it on blocks, lifted, ready to be moved. And there they are, moving it. So, notice you don't exactly have big giant flatbed trucks and you have to slide on logs and tow it with horses and graders. There's the result. So downtown Burton, we've got numbered highways now, so you can see that little Highway 6 sign on the right. And the turn in the middle of downtown Burton. So there's the original Community Hall in the foreground. And then you can see the store, the Burton Trading Company in the middle, and then the stone store down the street. Another person, one of the early pioneers of transportation and forestry on this lake was Andy Simons. Where Big Ledge is, in the mountains across from the Kusch behind Fostal there, that mountain is called Mount Simons. Even though he's more associated with Pinkston and Fostal, Andy Simons ultimately was buried here at Burton. Yeah, as you can see, 2 of his daughters died quite young. He actually, I'm not sure what nation they were from, but he married an indigenous woman, which was semi-taboo at the time. 1925, and we're already having old-timers reunions here, 30 years after the white people show up. So the idea behind this was anybody who had been here since the beginning or anybody who was over the age of 60. And this was a thing that Eugene Levesque would put on in the Kusch for about 5 years. It lasted until the early 30s, and it was called Old Man's Day. Yep. But yeah, if you were over 60 and somewhat long-time resident of the valley, then you were included. And you'll notice there's quite a few Burton people in here, including Clark Watt, John McLeod from Edgewood. You can see Arthur Burton, very distinctive looking in the back. And then John McCormick Sr. is in the front. So those would be some of the Burton people that made it to this old-timers reunion. And another great shot. This is Bill Marcoli Sr. on the right. The yours truly is Doris Keffer, Doris Hopp in the middle, and then Buddy Europe on the right. The Marcolis and the Roberts were the 2 main families. And of course, Marcolis are still around, but the Roberts are such a huge family. in the cusp. They were the two main families of what was called Bellevue, which is across the lake from Burton. This is a shot that Ernie Roberts took in 1995 when he went to go back to find his own school in the woods. And that's the abandoned 1920 schoolhouse at Bellevue. I couldn't even tell you if that's still around now. Bob Brett. Yeah, he was sort of a peripatetic figure in the Arrow Lakes. He'd move in, he had his family, then he kind of left his family, went back to the prairies, and then wound up back here in his elderly years in the 30s, going out and mining again. This came from his grandson who's now in his 80s living in Winlaw. And the Bretts have they had a long history in the early 1900s in the cusp. But ultimately Bob Brett winds up in Burton. Johnny Long is another man who's in this. He was one of the later internees in the cemetery. This is his marriage to Doris Adshead. So their daughter gave me this photo. And the man on the right, Cliff Green, is still around at 88. If you go into the archives in the cusp, if you come visit us and you see all these handmade stern wheeler and tugboat and dredge models, he's the one that made those. This is a retirement hobby. These are the steels of Burton. All the Halkins that were around in the middle 60s. Those were her children and Mr. Steele's stepkids. Yeah, she was one of the very last people interned in the old cemetery before it flooded. And you can see in the background the original Anglican church, which that building was brought up from the old town site and dropped right next door and became the Full Gospel Church. As I look towards the current residents of this house, sitting over there at the table. Bill Evans' house at the end of McCormick Road. Yeah, still standing. Yeah. Still, yeah. Any ghost stories about this?
Oh, yeah. Yes, actually, there's a good one. The people who bought it after the Evans had it, the Predators. Dunk Predator was off hunting with his brother, and a crew of people came through and said, for $350, we'll raise the house so you can dig a basement. And when Dunk and his brother got back to Burton, his house was on blocks. And Lenora said, you're going to have to dig a basement.
This is an interesting one. So this is the former store at West of Mars, opposite McDonald Creek, what people call the Bahamas now. R.L. June. And what's cool is that about 10 years ago, the Junes ultimately wind up emigrating to New Zealand in the 20s. And about 10 years ago, his grandson came and visited us at the office. That was really neat. Came up all the way from Hawke's Bay, New Zealand. The Junes, were at West of Mars. Ultimately, he moved the store to Burton. And that's how he moved it. It's wood, it'll float. I mentioned Lance Porter before. This is a postcard that he sent to somebody in Ontario, but ultimately it wound up back with him because Dawnette Olson brought this in. She had a lot of stuff just from her mom, who was a Robson, right? And this is Lance Porter writing to, that's him out in front, writing to this woman out in Ontario, showing her this is how we hay in Burton. You can just see, it's hard to see because it's pretty faded, but he's got a little inscription in the bottom right. All these postcards in this collection, they're all written to women for some reason. Oh, I hope the microphone caught that. Yeah, so I mentioned the Montalvetti property is legally where the cemetery sat. So here's Louis Montalvetti marrying Renee Mant with Isabel Gadon and Bill Marcoli Sr. as the wedding party. There's the last shot of the Montalvetti home. Of course, in my last show that I did here, the Back to Burton one, which is now online if you haven't seen it, all these wonderful shots that Mrs. Adshead took in 1965 of Burton right before they put it. I didn't want to repeat anything from that show for this one, but I figured that was just a good shot to show you the actual property that the cemetery technically sat on. I mentioned how narrow it was. That's how narrow it really was. And when you think about how much that lake expands now at high water, you can see, actually at center, how far that wharf had to come out just to hit water. And when you think about, you can see the town in the middle of it, of the photo, and how far out that is now compared to modern day, where the modern town site's way off there at the far right of the photo. You see how many people farmed right on those flats. High water 1967, the last year of the town site. You can see how high it came up and how little of the wharf is there. But you can see the handful of blocks that constituted the village of Burton. And the cemetery is way off in the back in that forest. Looking from the bluffs over top of the Burby farm towards the village of Burton in the background. This is 1964. Here's another shot. And keep in mind where this tree is that's on the right. So you're looking at that tree. That's 6 years later. So I'll go back. Forward. So you can see that grove of trees off going down toward the lake. That would be close to where the cemetery is. It's high water, so the one mound barely shows up, just sticking out from behind that tree. So I'll go back again one more time, and you can see where that would be. So yeah, and it's all just sort of what downtown Burton used to look like in winter. The Catholic church there, that's the one that they moved to Folkier. So that's the Folkier church now. Wardy Stone's house is at the left, and then the community hall is kind of hiding behind those trees, and then Steers General Store, again with that same coffee shop sign. So there's what's left of the Catholic Church. Yeah, this is April 2016, so I don't quite think it's going to look like that this April. There's a bit more snow this year, but yeah, when we went down there, we went through these flats, and when the water's that low, you really can see a lot of foundations down there still. So as I close out, like I said, there were a number of different cemeteries up and down the Arrow Lakes, all the way from Mount Cartier near Revelstoke down to Deer Park that had to be covered up. Only one cemetery, they actually relocated graves. That was the cemetery at Arrow Park, and they had to do that because it was so low that there's no way they could have prevented any erosion. So to preserve the remains, they actually took them and reinterred them in Glenbank, which is why Glenbank has such a large Arrow Park section. Because Glenbank Cemetery was brand new in 1965. This cemetery here at East Arrow Park. So that's what that little cairn is at the bottom end of Mole Frontage Road. commemorates that. Yeah. That is a shot of the Fauquier Cemetery. So all of these ones would have been covered up just with gravel and rock. That's Mount Cartier up by Revelstoke. So if you were to keep driving past turn off to the Revelstoke airport and the Revelstoke ski resort and just kept going down the side of that lake, the first town you would have come to was Mount Cartier. Yeah. Some never got properly acknowledged. The indigenous burial grounds at Needles and at Watchan. As you can see, just the one lone grave marker sort of poking up there. That's Deer Park Cemetery in June '67. So you can see all the orchards across the road from it. Right? And then the next year, and you can see the spots where the graves are. Next year, they did encase that in concrete. So this is one of the ones that was paved over. That's the Renata Cemetery in '67. And that's the Renata Cemetery in '68. Again, you can see they only covered up what they absolutely had to. And then, of course, it brings us back to what we're doing here. So hopefully in the next few years, you'll start to see some really interesting signage and interpretation of the site, so that people who do come to Burton, and there are more and more people coming to Burton all the time, so that they can really get a history of what lies beneath their feet. So that's my show. Thank you.
I thought there was a reason for the two separated spaces of the cemetery. That was one question. People also wanted to know about the actual burial plots, who's buried where. And the third piece is if you could comment about why our cemetery is unique in terms of its location and access. Yeah. So those three things.
Okay, as far as plots, because Burton Women's Institute kind of folded earlier, before there was a local historical society, so their records were donated to the BC archives in Victoria. So anything could have happened to them. And that's probably where I'm guessing all the cemetery records went. So as far as like plot numbers or any record, could not tell you. We don't know. We just don't. And it would take a lot of digging. It would take somebody to physically go to Victoria and dig through that. Right.
The areas, it was kind of discrimination or whatever. The Catholics got buried in the north end of the thing, and the Protestants got buried in the south end. And then there was another area, I think it was the odd Indian burial area, I think it was some of the other quarters.
Well, there we go. So I'll just repeat that. Okay. So Jim's saying that he heard that the Catholics were buried on the north side. The Protestants got that east side along the fence. And then there were a few miscellaneous burials, including the Joseph family and the native people. That was sort of, because you did see a kind of some isolated plots in the center of the field there. So that's, yeah, what do you think? But yeah, you can tell, like it's very distinct. There's quite obviously one portion on one side and one portion on the other. But that's why there's two mounds. Yeah.
And what makes our cemetery different than the other ones that were also either covered or cemented in?
Yeah, well, the fact that you can still get to it.
Yeah.
Right? Because those other ones, they're under water. Like, I would imagine Renata, because it's a big delta, might come up once in a while, but I've never been there to actually see it. And even if I did, would I recognize it? Whereas here, it's still, like, it's low enough that because they don't draw the water down as much with flood as high as they used to, there's a bit more regularity to it. They don't really get covered up anymore, right? They're always a couple hundred meters from where the water is. So you can still technically access every single part of the cemetery. It's just under those mounds. So there is a really unique opportunity for interpretation here that isn't available everywhere else. Other towns that were demolished, like Arrowhead, their cemetery remained intact. So you have to hike to get to it, but you can get to it. And all the markers are still there, and there are burials there into the 90s, right? Comaplex, hasn't been used in 110 years, but it's above the floodplain. You can still theoretically get to it if you want to hack through the bush. But all the cemeteries that were lost in the Arrow Lakes because of the dam, this is the only one that you can still theoretically get to. About time to pay some proper respect to it. Having the walkway go through the old cemetery grounds is, a really good opportunity for that.
Anybody have any more questions or comments?
No markers in that cemetery at all.
Not to my knowledge.
Yeah, no
The
markers.
question was there any markers?
There's no, I walked all through.
Yeah.
There's no markers, no headstones.
Covered by rock.
Were they all moved?
There's about, 24, would you say, that are listed as being moved or reinterred, whether that's the actual remains or just the marker, but yeah. Any of the older markers that you see in the new Burton Cemetery, those were moved from the old cemetery. So that did happen to about, a couple dozen or so.
I did have a question. Maybe some people have some questions.
Okay.
Yep.
So how many people are actually in that triangle that you keep referring to?
We counted it at
96.
96.
Okay, I thought it was in between, some of them had been moved to the new.
20 half.
20 half, so there's another 70 that are left there? or
No,
that's
96.
there's
Yeah.
still So that's quite a few, like if you look at the picture, I didn't count the headstones, but it didn't look to me like it was 96 of them.
Oh yeah, well, I imagine, especially in the earlier burials, a lot of them would have been unmarked. But it's hard to say because,
So the whole thing is covered by concrete or just?
just rocks.
Just rock?
Yeah, Deer Park got covered by concrete. Burton was just rocks. That's those two mounds that the walkway goes through. Yeah. So I guess technically that might mean there's a Catholic mound and a Protestant mound. Yeah.
I just, you were saying that East Darrow Park was all moved to Glen Bank?
Yeah.
Darrow Park
Yeah.
is not all moved.
Oh, okay.
Some of the moves, just as they requested at West Darrow Park and East Darrow Park, if you wish to have your family moved,
Oh.
they did it.
Yeah.
That cenotaph,
Yep.
below the cenotaph, it's covered up just like Burton
Yep.
in rocks.
Okay.
But does get flooded
Yeah.
every year.
Yeah.
But all the names that are on the cenotaph
Yeah.
are still buried there.
Okay. So the ones that they did move to Glenbank, they didn't put on that cairn?
That's right.
Okay. There we go.
I had somebody in the archives ask if the booklet that you put together, if there's going to be copies of it for sale.
The report that kind of it? We haven't got to that point. I think probably it'll be posted on the historical website and possibly our Burton Community website. You can access the report that way.
And that has the little bit of history about everything.
Yeah, and it's got a little write-up about people that came from newspapers and the whistle stop, correct?
Yeah. Wherever we could find stuff. Yeah. And again, that's Kathy's doing.
And Diana has.
So she gets the credit for that.
I have two questions. Are there any family cemeteries, like we're on farms and things like that in this area?
Not here. There were in Edgewood. Like if you go to that Vernon District Family History website, you'll see that there's a Kirby family cemetery in Edgewood that's still out in a farm up in the Oakland Valley there. And that was their earliest actual burials. But here, as far as we know, none.
Well, we have a little surprise for you.
Okay, I'll stop recording right now then.